Maria had always been a quiet woman. She lived on the edge of a small countryside village, in a simple wooden house that once belonged to her grandmother. Life had never been loud or dramatic for her, she preferred stillness. She worked in her garden, cared for her chickens, and spent evenings reading by the oil lamp. Most of the villagers thought of her as unusual, but harmless. She never joined in gossip or festivals, she simply lived in her own rhythm. One chilly autumn morning, Maria decided to attend Mass at the local church. The building was small but tall in presence, with old stone walls and a bell that rang across the fields every Sunday. For as long as she could remember, Father Elias had been the one leading prayers there. He was a tall man, with a commanding voice that filled the air like rolling thunder. To the villagers, he was more than a priest, he was almost untouchable. He had baptized their children, buried their loved ones, and advised them on every matter from faith to farming. His words carried weight, and people rarely questioned him. Maria had not been inside the church for several years. When she stepped in, the heavy wooden door creaked, and the scent of wax candles and old wood filled her senses. People turned their heads slightly, surprised to see her there. She walked slowly to the last row of pews, keeping her eyes lowered. She was not there for ritual or comfort, she was there because something inside her told her to go. As the sermon began, Father Elias spoke with energy. His words were smooth, practiced, almost theatrical. He spoke of sin, of purity, of how the villagers must remain obedient to God and to the order of life as it had always been. People nodded, whispering amen under their breath. But Maria sat silently. She did not nod. She did not whisper. She only watched. When the Mass ended, villagers lined up to greet the priest, to kiss his hand and offer small gifts, jars of honey, bread, or coins for the church. Maria did not join the line. Instead, she waited near the side wall, until the last person had left. Father Elias finally noticed her standing there. His lips curved into a polite smile, the kind reserved for strangers or difficult people. "Maria," he said warmly, though his tone carried a hint of curiosity. "It has been a long time since you've joined us here. What brings you back?" Maria's eyes did not waver. They were steady, almost unsettling in their stillness. "I wanted to speak with you," she answered softly. The priest gestured for her to follow him into the rectory, a small room behind the altar filled with books and wooden shelves. A golden cross hung on the wall, glimmering faintly in the dim light. Father Elias motioned for her to sit, but Maria remained standing. "I can see you're evil," she said suddenly, her voice firm but not loud. For a moment, the words hung in the air like smoke. Then Father Elias laughed, a deep, hearty laugh that echoed in the small room. He leaned back in his chair, his shoulders shaking. "My child," he said between chuckles, "you have a wild imagination." "Evil? In me? Surely you jest." But Maria did not smile. She did not move. She repeated, "I can see you're evil." The laughter softened into a chuckle, and then into silence. The priest's eyes narrowed slightly. He was a man used to being respected, never confronted. Yet here stood Maria, with calm certainty, speaking as though she knew something others did not. "What makes you say such a thing?" he asked at last, his tone shifting to something heavier. Maria tilted her head slightly. "Because it is there. You can pretend with others. You can hide behind sermons and rituals. But I see what you hide." The room felt colder. Father Elias forced another laugh, though it sounded less natural now. "You should be careful with your words. People may think you are unstable." Maria blinked slowly, as though she had already expected him to say that. "Let them think what they wish," she replied. "But you cannot laugh away the truth." For the first time, Father Elias felt an unusual discomfort. He had faced complaints before, people upset with his decisions, even arguments about traditions. But this was different. Maria did not accuse him with rage or bitterness, she simply stated her words as though she were naming the color of the sky. There was no doubt in her voice. After a moment, she turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. She looked over her shoulder and said, "When the time comes, others will see it too." Then she walked out, her steps slow but steady, leaving the priest alone in the dim light of the room. That night, Father Elias sat in his study longer than usual. He told himself it was nonsense, the rambling of a lonely woman who had too much imagination. And yet, her words clung to him. He found himself recalling the way her eyes had held his, unblinking, as though she were peering past his flesh and into his soul. He poured himself a glass of water, but his hand trembled slightly as he lifted it. The next Sunday, Maria returned to the church. Again, she sat silently at the back. Again, she watched, her eyes never leaving him as he preached. And again, when the Mass ended, she stayed behind while the others left. "Maria," Father Elias said with forced patience, "why do you continue to come here?" She answered with the same calm tone. "Because the truth cannot stay hidden forever." His jaw tightened. "Do you expect to frighten me with riddles? Do you think you are some prophet?" "I don't think," Maria replied simply. "I know." And then, without another word, she walked out again, leaving the priest with his own thoughts. The villagers began to notice. They whispered about Maria's return, about the way she lingered in the church, about the strange conversations she seemed to have with Father Elias. Some laughed at her, calling her strange as they always had. But others began to wonder. Her words, though never spoken aloud to the whole village, seemed to hang in the air, carried quietly from one person's curiosity to another's doubt. Father Elias tried to dismiss it. He told himself he was above suspicion. He had served the village faithfully for decades, his position was secure. But late at night, when the church was empty and the candles had burned down to stubs, he could still hear Maria's calm voice in his mind, "I can see you're evil." And though he laughed when she said it aloud, alone in the dark he no longer laughed at all. The days passed quietly in the village, but under the calm surface, small waves of unease began to stir. People carried on with their daily routines, working in fields, tending animals, baking bread, and trading in the market, but whispers traveled faster than footsteps. Some villagers laughed about Maria's sudden return to church, saying she was odd and looking for attention. Others shook their heads and wondered if there was more to her words than they first believed. Father Elias, however, could not laugh as freely as he used to. His smile in public remained wide, his voice strong during sermons, but inside his chest there was a faint tension that refused to leave. Every time Maria appeared, sitting silently in the last pew, he felt her presence like a weight pressing against him. She never spoke aloud to the congregation, never made a scene, but her eyes never left him. One evening, after Mass, Father Elias sat with two of the village elders who had known him since his arrival decades earlier. They were discussing repairs to the church roof when one of them, an older man named Stefan, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Father," Stefan began, "I must ask, this woman, Maria. She seems to trouble you. People notice she stares at you often. Is there some misunderstanding between you two?" Father Elias forced a smile. "She is harmless, Stefan. A woman who lives too much in her thoughts. Perhaps loneliness makes her see shadows where none exist." The elder nodded slowly, yet he still looked uneasy. "Yes, perhaps. Still, she speaks strangely. Some say she hinted about secrets." "Secrets in the church?" At this, the priest's smile tightened. "Superstitions," he said firmly. "Do not give weight to nonsense. I serve this village with honesty, as I always have." Stefan lowered his gaze respectfully, but the small seed of doubt had already been planted. Meanwhile, Maria continued her routine. She tended to her garden during the week and returned to the church every Sunday. Children sometimes peeked at her curiously, whispering and giggling, calling her the strange woman who talks in riddles. Yet she paid no attention to them. She carried herself with quiet dignity, never shouting, never arguing. But the calmness with which she stared at Father Elias made some adults feel uneasy, even if they pretended otherwise. One afternoon, as Maria was returning from the well with a bucket of water, a neighbor named Lydia stopped her. Lydia was a kind woman, though easily influenced by rumors. She spoke in a hushed tone. "Maria, forgive me for asking, but why do you keep going to the church? People are talking. They say you speak against Father Elias. He is respected here. He has done so much for us." Maria looked at her calmly. "I do not speak against him. I speak what I see." Lydia frowned. "But what do you mean, see? See what?" "Others see nothing unusual. Not everything is visible to the eyes," Maria replied softly. "Sometimes truth hides until it is called out." Her words unsettled Lydia, who quickly changed the subject and hurried away. But later, she shared the conversation with her husband, and by nightfall, the story spread quietly from house to house. Some repeated it mockingly, others listened with growing curiosity. Father Elias heard of these whispers soon enough. A young altar boy mentioned them carelessly, not realizing the effect his words would have. That evening, the priest sat alone in his study, staring at the flickering flame of a candle. He told himself again that Maria was only a lonely woman stirring unnecessary trouble. But the thought returned like a thorn: what if people began to believe her? On the following Sunday, the church was fuller than usual. It seemed more villagers than normal wanted to hear the sermon, or perhaps to see the strange woman who dared to confront the priest. Maria was there, as always, seated at the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Father Elias spoke louder that day, with more passion, as though he were trying to drown out invisible voices. He preached about loyalty, about obedience, about the dangers of false prophets and wandering imaginations. He reminded the villagers that faith required trust in their shepherd. His words were strong, but his eyes kept darting toward the last row where Maria sat in silence. When the service ended, people filed out slowly, glancing back at Maria. Some shook their heads and muttered that she was a fool. Others, though they said nothing, lingered a little longer, as if waiting to see whether something unusual might happen. It did. As the last of the crowd left, Maria walked calmly down the aisle, her footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor. She stopped near the altar, where Father Elias was gathering his books. He did not look at her at first, but when she spoke, his hands froze. "Why do you preach about false prophets?" she asked quietly. He turned to her, his face stern. "Because there are always those who mislead others with false visions and wild claims." Maria's voice remained steady. "Or perhaps because you fear the truth being spoken aloud." The priest's jaw clenched. For a moment, it seemed he might lash out with harsh words, but then he forced another laugh. "You test my patience, Maria. These games of yours will only harm your own reputation. People will call you mad." Maria tilted her head slightly, the same way she had the first time. "I do not need reputation. I only need truth." With that, she turned and walked away once more, leaving the echo of her words behind her. By now, the whispers had grown louder. Some villagers scoffed openly, saying Maria was trying to make herself important. Others admitted in private that her calmness was unnerving. She never shouted, never argued, and yet her quiet statements carried more weight than empty gossip. One evening, a small group of villagers gathered in Stefan's barn, talking in low voices. Lydia was there, along with her husband and a few others. They spoke about Maria's strange warnings, about the priest's unease, about how his sermons lately seemed sharper, almost defensive. "What if she is right?" one man whispered. "What if there is something he hides?" "Impossible," another replied. "Father Elias has been here for 20 years. He has blessed our children, buried our parents. He cannot be, yet why does he laugh so nervously when she speaks?" Lydia interrupted. I saw it myself. She looks at him, and he pretends to laugh, but his face changes. As if he is afraid. The group fell silent at her words. Fear was not something they associated with their priest. Authority, wisdom, power, yes. But fear? That was new. Meanwhile, Maria carried on as if unaware of the storm she was quietly creating. She continued her daily life, simple and unchanging, but every Sunday she returned to the church and faced the priest without blinking. Father Elias, however, could no longer ignore her presence. He prayed longer at night, but his prayers felt heavy and hollow. He avoided eye contact with certain villagers, worried that doubt was already brewing in their minds. The sound of Maria's words haunted him, the truth cannot stay hidden forever. He laughed in public, he preached with energy, but alone in his study he sometimes pressed his hands against his face and whispered to himself, "She cannot know. She cannot know," but the unease only deepened. And though he tried to silence it, he began to wonder whether Maria's presence was not just coincidence, but the beginning of something he had long feared, the slow unmasking of secrets he had buried for years. The village was restless. For weeks, Maria's quiet words and calm presence had unsettled what was once a place of unquestioned trust. The people had lived under the guidance of Father Elias for so long that they never thought to doubt him. He had been the voice of their prayers, the authority at their weddings, the comfort at their funerals. To them, he had been almost untouchable. But now, a seed of suspicion had been planted, and though most tried to brush it away, the roots of that doubt were already growing. Maria herself never forced her words on anyone. She never knocked on doors or gathered people around her. She simply continued what she had always done, tending her small home, visiting the church each week, and speaking only when she felt the moment required it. It was her calmness that made her words powerful. She never shouted, never accused with rage. She simply stated what she knew, and the stillness in her tone carried a weight stronger than anger. Father Elias, however, was not calm. His heart carried a storm. In public, he wore the same warm smile and spoke with the same booming voice, but behind closed doors, his thoughts raced. He had once been a man who enjoyed control of the church, control of the respect the villagers gave him, control of how people saw him. Now, for the first time in years, he felt something slipping. On a bright Sunday morning, the church was unusually crowded. Word had spread that Maria had spoken again the week before, and curiosity drew more villagers than usual. Some came out of habit, but many came with quiet anticipation. They wanted to see if she would speak again, and what the priest's reaction would be. The Mass began like all others. The priest stood at the front, raising his hands, chanting prayers that echoed across the stone walls. The villagers bowed their heads, whispering Amen. But many pairs of eyes, though lowered in respect, flickered toward the back of the room where Maria sat. She was dressed simply, in a plain grey dress, her hair tied back neatly. Her posture was straight, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look around the church. She did not smile at the curious stares. Her eyes were fixed only on Father Elias. The priest spoke louder that morning, his voice carrying a sharp edge. He preached about loyalty to faith, about how the shepherd protects the flock, and about how dangerous it was to allow doubt into the heart. Doubt, he declared, raising his hand, is the seed of ruin. A single seed of mistrust can tear apart what has been built for generations. Do not let false words poison your faith. The villagers nodded, though some shifted uneasily. His words were strong, but there was a defensiveness to them, a forcefulness that many had not noticed before. It was as though he was not only speaking to the congregation but also fighting an unseen opponent. When the sermon ended, the people slowly began to leave. But as always, Maria did not move. She sat in her place, waiting until the last villager had gone. Finally, she stood, her footsteps soft on the stone floor, and walked calmly to the front of the church where Father Elias was arranging his books. He looked up, his eyes tense though his smile remained. "Maria," he said in a voice that tried to sound light, "will you stand before me every week with this silence?" Her gaze held his firmly. "I do not need to speak every week," she replied softly. "The time to speak has come now." The priest's hand froze on the book. "And what do you mean by that?" Maria turned slowly, her eyes sweeping across the church. A few villagers had lingered near the doorway, curious enough to stay behind. They watched with cautious interest as Maria's voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the room. "You preach of truth," she said, "but the truth does not belong to words alone. It lives in what is hidden, in what you keep away from sight." Father Elias laughed quickly, though the sound was forced. "Here we are again," he said, shaking his head. "More riddles, more shadows. Why do you insist on wasting everyone's time with such nonsense?" But Maria did not smile. Her eyes seemed to look through him, steady and unwavering. She stepped closer to the altar and said clearly, "You hide more than sermons here. You hide what you fear others will find." A murmur rippled through the few who lingered near the door. The priest stiffened, but Maria's voice grew stronger, though still calm. "There is a chamber," she said. "Beneath the rectory. You have sealed it away, but it is there. And under the boards, in that chamber, you keep the things you cannot show. Letters, records, pieces of the past you thought would remain buried." For the first time, Father Elias's composure cracked. His eyes widened, and his mouth opened slightly, as though he had been struck by something invisible. Then, realizing how many eyes were on him, he forced a laugh, though it came out hollow and strained. "Ridiculous," he said, waving a hand. "Utterly ridiculous. Do you hear this, my children? A woman claims to see hidden rooms and secret boards. Should we now believe in fairy tales?" But his voice trembled slightly at the edges. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Maria, however, did not back down. She looked directly into his eyes and said, "You may laugh, Father. But the truth does not hide forever. What is hidden in the ground will rise. What is sealed away will be uncovered. And when it is, your laughter will no longer protect you." The church was silent. The only sound was the faint crackle of a candle burning near the altar. The priest tried to smile again, but it no longer reached his eyes. He gathered his books quickly and turned his back, pretending to be too busy to answer her. Maria watched him for a moment, then nodded gently, as if she had said what needed to be said. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the church, her footsteps echoing with finality. The few villagers who had stayed behind whispered urgently to one another. They had seen his face, the flicker of fear that passed before he laughed. They had seen how his voice shook. And though no one dared to speak too loudly, the seed of doubt that Maria had planted now had water. That evening, small groups gathered in corners of the village, speaking in hushed tones. Some dismissed her as a dreamer, a woman who lived too much in her imagination. But others repeated her words about the hidden chamber, about the sealed boards, about things buried beneath the rectory. "Why did his face change if it was all lies?" someone asked. "Why did he tremble?" another added. "Maybe," whispered Lydia, "maybe she does see something we cannot." Father Elias heard the whispers too. He sat alone in his room, staring at the floorboards as if Maria's words had given them a voice. The shadows in the corners seemed darker than before, the silence heavier. He told himself she was bluffing, guessing, trying to frighten him. And yet, how could she have spoken of the chamber? How could she know about the things hidden away? That night, he did not sleep. He paced the room until dawn, his mind racing. Maria's voice echoed in his thoughts again and again, "What is hidden in the ground will rise. What is sealed away will be uncovered." The laughter he had used so easily before no longer came. For the first time in years, Father Elias felt that his secrets were not safe. The church bell rang early that Sunday morning, echoing across the quiet valley. People dressed in their best clothes and walked toward the old stone church, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. But unlike other weeks, there was a different kind of energy in the air. Curiosity had grown too strong to ignore. Everyone had heard Maria's bold words from the last service. Some had dismissed her, but many had not. And all of them wanted to see what would happen next. Inside the church, the wooden pews filled quickly. Mothers hushed their children, men folded their arms, and the elderly leaned forward with sharp eyes. At the back of the church, as always, sat Maria. She looked the same as before, quiet, composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her presence no longer startled people, but it unsettled them. It was as if she carried a question into the room that no one dared to answer. Father Elias entered wearing his robes, his face calm, his steps steady. He lifted his hands in blessing, and his voice boomed through the air as he began the Mass. But those who watched closely could see something different. His voice was strong, but it carried strain, like a rope pulled too tightly. His eyes darted now and then toward the back pew, as though Maria's silent stare were louder than the prayers of the entire congregation. The sermon began. Father Elias spoke of unity, of how a village must not fall to division, of how rumors were the enemy of peace. He reminded the people of all he had given them through the years, of how trust was the foundation of faith. The villagers listened politely, but whispers of Maria's earlier words echoed in their minds. Trust, yes, but what of the hidden chamber? What of the sealed boards? When the Mass ended, the congregation did not rush out as quickly as usual. Many lingered, pretending to chat, but really waiting. Maria, too, remained seated, her face calm. Slowly, she rose and walked toward the altar. A hush spread across the room. Everyone knew something was about to happen. Father Elias forced a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. Maria, he said with a laugh that sounded hollow in the silent church, will you trouble us again today? She looked at him evenly. I will not trouble you. The truth itself will trouble you. The room tensed. Villagers leaned closer, their breaths quiet. Maria's voice was steady as she spoke. You told them to trust, but you have hidden from them. Beneath the rectory floor lies a chamber you sealed long ago. Inside it are the things you hoped would never be seen. Letters, records, and proof of how you have used this church for yourself. Gasps filled the air. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others looked at the priest sharply. Father Elias tried to laugh again, but his face flushed red. He raised his hands as if to calm the room. My children, he said quickly, do not listen to this nonsense. She is a woman with wild visions. There is nothing beneath the rectory but stone and dust. But Maria did not back away. Her words came like a slow river, calm but unstoppable. If there is nothing, then let them look. If there is no chamber, let them see with their own eyes. If I am wrong, I will never return here again. The challenge hung in the air like thunder. The villagers turned to each other, whispering nervously. Curiosity burned too strongly now. What harm would it do to check? And what harm would it do to prove Maria wrong once and for all? An elder named Stefan stepped forward. His voice shook slightly, but it carried authority. Father Elias, he said, perhaps it is best. Let us look. If there is nothing, this matter will end, and peace will return to the village. The priest's eyes flashed, but he was trapped. To refuse would raise suspicion. To allow it risked exposure. He swallowed hard and forced a tight smile. Very well, he said. If that is what you wish, then let us put these foolish rumors to rest. The villagers followed as the group moved to the rectory, the small building behind the altar where the priest kept his study. The room was crowded with books, candles, and a large wooden desk. Father Elias stood stiffly near the wall as Stefan and a few strong men began tapping on the floorboards. At first, all they heard was the hollow thud of wood. But then, near the corner, the sound changed. A deeper echo, not of solid ground but of empty space. The men exchanged glances. Someone fetched a crowbar, and with effort, they pried the boards loose. Dust rose into the air, and a gasp rippled through the crowd. Beneath the floor was a dark opening. A hidden chamber, just as Maria had said. The room filled with murmurs. She was right. How did she know? What is down there? One of the men lit a lantern and lowered it carefully into the opening. The flickering light revealed shelves lined with old boxes and bundles wrapped in cloth. The smell of damp paper rose up. Slowly, the men climbed down and began lifting the items into the light. The villagers crowded around as boxes were opened. Inside were stacks of letters, sealed envelopes, and records carefully hidden away. Some were written in the priest's own hand. They spoke of money collected for repairs that had never been done, of favors exchanged quietly, of promises made to benefit himself more than the church. Nothing violent, but enough to show deceit, enough to break the trust the people had given him. The crowd grew louder, voices rising with shock and anger. All these years, he told us to trust him. We gave our coins, our labor. Father Elias's face turned pale. He raised his hands desperately. My children, please listen to me. These are old papers, nothing of importance. Do not be misled. But his voice trembled, and his eyes darted nervously. The villagers no longer looked at him with respect. Their eyes carried something heavier: betrayal. Maria stood quietly near the doorway, her expression calm. She did not gloat or raise her voice. She simply said, "The truth does not stay buried. It always waits." Her words silenced the room for a moment. Even those who had doubted her now looked at her with a new kind of respect, or perhaps fear. The elders stepped forward, their faces grave. "Father Elias," Stephen said slowly, "we cannot ignore this. You have deceived us. We trusted you with our lives, with our faith. And now we see the truth." The priest's shoulders sagged. The laughter that had once filled the church with warmth had vanished completely. He looked around at the villagers' faces he had known for decades, faces that once adored him, and he saw only disappointment and anger. He tried to speak again, but no words came. One by one, the villagers began to step back, as if the man they had trusted for so long was now a stranger. No one shouted. No one raised a hand. But the silence itself was heavier than any punishment. Father Elias sank into a chair, his head in his hands. For the first time, he felt the weight of being truly exposed. His power, his authority, his laughter, all of it had crumbled in a single day. And Maria? She turned quietly and left the rectory, walking back through the village streets with steady steps. She did not smile or celebrate. She had said her words, and the truth had risen. That was enough. The villagers watched her go, their minds swirling with questions. Who was this quiet woman who had seen what no one else could? And how long had the truth been waiting, buried beneath their very feet? The church bell rang the following Sunday, but its sound felt different. It no longer carried the same sense of pride or peace that it once had. Instead, it echoed through the village like a reminder of something broken. For years, the bell had called the people together to pray under the voice of Father Elias, but now that trust was gone. The villagers still gathered. They were not sure what else to do. Faith was a habit, and habit is hard to break. But when they entered the old stone church, the air felt heavier than before. The pews filled slowly, conversations were hushed, and people avoided each other's eyes. Everyone wondered the same thing: would Father Elias stand before them again, or had his time already ended? Maria was there as well. She sat in her usual place at the back, quiet and still. Unlike the others, she carried no confusion or hesitation. She looked calm, almost distant, as though she already knew what would unfold. At last, Father Elias appeared. His shoulders seemed smaller than before, his robes less grand. He did not enter with his usual booming confidence. His steps were slower, and his eyes avoided the crowd. When he reached the altar, he stood in silence for a long time, gripping the edges of the lectern as though it were the only thing holding him upright. "My children," he began, his voice softer than ever, "I know you look at me now with anger, with doubt, with disappointment. And you have reason. I have failed you." The room was still. No one moved. No one dared to whisper. "I stood here for years, speaking of truth, of faith, of honesty. Yet I did not live by the very words I preached. I allowed myself to hide things. I let pride blind me. And though I told myself they were small matters, not worth your concern, I know now that even small shadows can darken the light if left unconfessed." He paused, his eyes glistening. "You trusted me. You believed in me. And I betrayed that trust. For this, I can only ask for your forgiveness, though I know it will not come easily." A long silence followed. Some villagers looked down, unsure how to feel. Others shook their heads. Forgiveness was not so simple. Years of respect could not be rebuilt in a single speech. Maria sat quietly, listening. She did not nod, did not shake her head. Her expression remained calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had already known this moment would come, the moment when his laughter would fail, when he could no longer hide behind words. In the days that followed, the village changed. The elders gathered and made decisions. Father Elias stepped down from his position, and arrangements were made to bring another priest to lead the church. The once powerful man was now only a quiet figure who stayed inside the rectory, rarely seen, his laughter gone. For the villagers, it was not easy. Some felt betrayed, others felt foolish for never questioning before. Conversations in the market and along the fields were filled with sighs and questions. "How could we have been blind?" one would say. "We trusted him with everything," another would add. Yet, slowly, the community began to adjust. They repaired the church roof that had long been neglected. They organized tasks themselves instead of waiting for orders. In a way, the breaking of their trust forced them to stand together in new strength. As for Maria, she returned to her quiet life. She tended her garden, fetched water from the well, and cared for her chickens. But the villagers no longer looked at her with the same eyes. Some avoided her, uneasy in her presence. Others approached her with quiet respect, whispering thanks. A few even asked her how she knew, but she never explained. One afternoon, Lydia came to visit her. She stood at the small wooden gate, wringing her hands nervously before speaking. "Maria," she said softly, "I wanted to thank you. You spoke when no one else would. You saw what we could not." Maria smiled faintly. "The truth always waits," she replied. "It does not belong to me. I only gave it a voice." Lydia hesitated, then asked, "But, how did you see it? How did you know?" Maria's eyes softened, but her answer was simple. "Sometimes the heart speaks what the eyes cannot. I listened." She left it at that, and Lydia, though unsatisfied, did not press further. She walked away, carrying Maria's words in her heart. As weeks passed, the story spread beyond the village. Travelers carried whispers of the priest who laughed at a woman until she revealed what he had hidden. Some added details, some twisted the story, but the heart of it remained. A quiet woman had seen what others refused to see, and the truth had come to light. Maria herself paid little attention to the stories. She had not spoken to be remembered. She had spoken because it was necessary. When people asked her if she was proud, she only shook her head. "Pride belongs to those who seek glory," she would say. "I only sought truth." The seasons changed. Leaves turned gold and fell, snow covered the rooftops, and spring returned with green fields. The village healed slowly, scars of betrayal fading into lessons remembered. A new priest arrived, gentle, humble, willing to rebuild trust with patience. The church bell once again rang with hope, though its sound would forever carry the memory of what had happened. And Maria? She remained the same, quiet, steady, with eyes that seemed to see deeper than the surface. Children no longer giggled at her as before. Instead, they watched her with curiosity and a hint of reverence. Adults greeted her politely, some with genuine gratitude, others with unease. But no one dismissed her anymore. Years later, when people looked back on that time, they spoke of many things. Some spoke of betrayal, others of renewal. But almost everyone remembered the woman who sat at the back of the church, who spoke few words, but whose words changed everything. They remembered how the priest had laughed, confident and dismissive, until her calm voice revealed what he had hidden. They remembered the silence that followed, the shock of discovery, and the way truth had risen like the dawn, no matter how deeply buried. And when they spoke of Maria, they did not call her mad, or strange, or foolish. They called her something else. Some said she was wise. Others said she was gifted. But most simply said she was the one who reminded them that nothing stays hidden forever. Maria herself never claimed any title. She continued her days in quiet peace, her heart free of the weight it once carried. When asked what she thought of everything that had happened, her answer was always the same. "The truth is not mine or yours," she would say gently. "It belongs to time. And time always reveals it." And so the story of Maria and Father Elias lived on, not as a tale of anger, but as a lesson carved into the memory of the village. A lesson that reminded them all: laughter may dismiss, words may deny, but the truth has a life of its own. It waits, it lingers, and when the moment comes, it rises stronger than denial, louder.